winter of 1812, 15 children disappeared from a small frontier settlement in what would one day become southern Illinois, and what seemed at first to be a string of wilderness tragedies or Indian raids turned out to be something far more sinister. These vanishings were planned with care and carried out by the very people trusted most with the children's education and spiritual guidance. For nearly 3 years, the Kensington family ran the Prairie View Academy, winning admiration across 3 counties as devoted educators. But behind their facade of piety lay horrors so dark that when the truth came to light, territorial authorities chose to bury it forever. Records were sealed, the few survivors hidden away, and the story deliberately erased from memory. The truth was not uncovered by investigation, but by the last words of a dying child who managed to escape confessing to her mother what she had seen. Those final words revealed a network of ritualistic murder operating in secret under the guise of Christian schooling for more than 3 years. The government responded immediately, wiping away every trace of evidence, relocating witnesses, and destroying all documents that could expose what the sealed archives would later call the Prairie View Incident. Before we delve into the terrible history of the Kensington family and their schoolhouse of nightmares, make sure you are following along, because what you are about to hear has been pieced together from forgotten testimonies, sealed court files, and the private journals of those who lived through it. This story begins not with violence, but with hope, the hope of parents desperate to give their children an education and a chance at a better life. In 1812, Illinois was a harsh, unforgiving frontier where survival depended on trust and community. Prairie View, a small settlement of about 200 people along the Sangamon River, promised fertile land for those willing to brave the wilderness. These were families mostly from Kentucky and Tennessee, fleeing poor soil and growing tensions that would soon lead to war. The town itself was little more than a scattering of cabins, connected by muddy paths anchored by Jeremiah Caldwell's General Store, which doubled as a town hall and a tiny Methodist chapel, visited by a circuit preacher whenever the weather allowed. Life was hard, ruled by the seasons, and children were expected to work from the moment they were strong enough to hold a tool. Schooling was a luxury most could not afford. The nearest real school was 60 miles away in Kaskaskia, far beyond the reach of ordinary settlers. With more than 70% of the town unable to read or write, the dream of education seemed hopeless until the spring of 1809, when Cornelius and Matilda Kensington arrived like an answer to prayer. Cornelius, a tall, thin man with sharp gray eyes and hair gone white long before its time, claimed he had studied at a Pennsylvania seminary and been called by God to bring learning to the frontier. He spoke Latin and Greek, quoted scripture at length, and brought with him a library of religious and academic books that awed even the most skeptical settlers. His wife, Matilda, the daughter of a Philadelphia schoolmaster, matched his reputation with her strict but patient manner. She was a severe-looking woman with pale blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. Yet she handled the children with a steady patience and promised to guide them into a better future. What the people of Prairie View did not know was that this family's arrival marked the beginning of the darkest chapter their community would ever face. Her wide knowledge of literature, mathematics, and domestic arts quickly convinced the families of Prairie View that their children were about to receive an education as good as anything back in the eastern cities. Adding to the appeal were the Kensington twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, 24 years old, identical to such a degree that even neighbors who saw them every day struggled to tell them apart. Pale, thin, soft-spoken, and eerily synchronized in both speech and manner, they unsettled some, yet impressed all with their devotion. voices always in unison gave the impression of a single mind, divided between two bodies. Like their father, they had been steeped in scripture and religious training from childhood and could deliver prayers, sermons, and theological discussions with a sophistication rare on the frontier. Their arrival was prefaced by glowing letters of introduction from prominent Pennsylvania clergy, though the details were vague and impossible to verify. Cornelius explained that these letters merely confirmed what had already been set in motion by a vision he claimed to have received from God, a vision of children lost in darkness, begging for guidance and light. That vision, he said, brought them west. It was on that promise that Prairie View Academy was born, housed in a sprawling 2-story log structure built on a hill overlooking the entire settlement. For 8 long months, the townsmen labored beside Cornelius, cutting and hauling logs, stacking stones, and shaping the wilderness into something they believed would change their children's lives. In return for their sweat, he promised them a place for their sons and daughters to learn at little or no cost. The building by frontier standards was extraordinary: 24 rooms, including separate dormitories for boys and girls' classrooms, a chapel, and living quarters for the Kensington family. There were curious features in its design, which Cornelius attributed to advanced educational theories. Windowless private study rooms, a basement chapel, and storage spaces that seemed much too large for the needs of a simple school. These oddities did not diminish the community's enthusiasm. The Kensingtons accepted both local children and boarders, setting fees that even struggling families could pay in produce, livestock, or manual labor instead of cash. In a land where most children grew up with only the most basic literacy, Prairie View Academy offered instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, natural philosophy, Latin, and religious studies, a breadth of subjects that rivaled the best schools of the Eastern Seaboard. Word spread quickly through churches, markets, and trading posts. And soon families from across 3 counties were arranging to move closer to Prairie View or to have their children board at the school during the idle winter months. To all appearances, the Kensingtons were models of devotion. Cornelius led daily chapel services, weaving scripture with lessons on obedient sacrifice and submission to God's will. Matilda's teaching methods, born from patience and a deep understanding of her students' limitations, brought a spark of curiosity to children who had never before held a book. She used stories from farm life to explain arithmetic, turned reading into games, and coaxed hesitant young minds into opening like flowers. The twins, though their silence and ghost-like presence unsettled the children, never resorted to whippings or beatings to maintain order. Instead, they called misbehaving students into private rooms where they spoke gently but firmly about sin and repentance, an approach that parents regarded as both merciful and effective. By the winter of 1811, the school had grown into something remarkable. More than 30 children boarded at the academy, living under the Kensington roof through the cold months, while their parents, grateful for the relief from extra mouths to feed, worked to keep their homes and farms alive. The Kensingtons wrote letters filled with progress reports and reassurances, and the arrangement seemed to benefit everyone. Education, safety, and moral guidance for the children, fewer burdens for the parents, and a steady flow of students and resources that made Prairie View Academy the pride of the frontier. Yet beneath that shining surface, the darkness that had first appeared in Cornelius's vision was quietly closing in. None of the parents in Prairie View could have imagined that by sending their children to the Kensingtons, they were placing them directly into the hands of monsters who had perfected the art of appearing righteous while hiding the darkest of intentions. The family had spent years studying exactly what a frontier community longed to hear, carefully shaping themselves into the perfect answer to every parent's prayer. For 3 long years, their mask of kindness would remain unbroken, protected by the innocence of their victims and the desperate hope of a town that wanted to believe goodness could still exist in such a harsh world. The first disappearance happened on November 23, 1811, though at first no one recognized it for what it was. 12-year-old Samuel Hartwell, the blacksmith's only son from nearby Cedar Creek, failed to come home for Thanksgiving as expected. Samuel had been living at Prairie View Academy since early October, and his cheerful letters had been full of excitement about his studies and gratitude for the chance to be part of the school. When he failed to arrive home on time, his father William assumed storms or confusion about travel plans had caused a delay. That autumn had been brutal, with snow coming early and turning roads to ice. Knowing Cornelius Kensington was cautious with travel, William tried to be patient. But after 3 more silent days, he saddled his horse and made the 20-mile journey through slush, slushy, and snow, determined to bring his boy home. By the time William arrived at Prairie View that evening, the sun was sinking and the big log academy looked warm and welcoming. Light glowed from its windows. Smoke curled up from its chimneys, and the sound of children's voices singing hymns floated on the cold air. Everything seemed so peaceful that his worry began to ease. Then Cornelius Kensington met him at the gate, and the look on the man's face froze him to the core. Gone was the calm, confident educator. Instead, Cornelius looked stricken, his hands trembling as he reached out. "Brother Hartwell," he said softly, his voice soaked in grief, "I fear the Lord has called your Samuel home to his eternal reward." He explained that Samuel had been struck by a sudden fever 3 days before while studying. They had tried everything, Matilda sitting at his bedside without rest, praying over him, but nothing could stop the sickness. The boy had grown weaker by the hour, until at last he passed quietly in his sleep, asking for his parents with his final breath. The weather had been too severe to send word, Cornelius said, and they feared that waiting for William to arrive would only allow the body to decay. So they had buried Samuel quickly in their family plot behind the chapel, giving him a proper Christian funeral. Matilda joined them, then eyes red from crying. "Samuel was such a bright and godly child," she said. His last words were of how thankful he was for the chance to learn here, and how he had come to love Jesus more deeply through this trial. We prayed he would find peace. William was crushed, but saw no reason to doubt them. Children died suddenly on the frontier all the time. He followed them to the small graveyard behind the chapel, where a fresh wooden cross bore his son's name, his short life carved into the wood with a simple message: "Beloved student, now with Jesus." As tears blurred his vision, Matilda handed him Samuel's belongings tied in a cloth bundle. His few clothes, a small writing slate, a carved wooden cross as a memorial gift, and a lock of his son's hair bound with a blue ribbon, cut just before burial. To the grieving father, their compassion seemed genuine, and for the moment, that was enough. The careful detail and heartfelt emotion in Matilda Kensington's words convinced William Hartwell that they had done everything humanly possible to save his boy. And he rode home in a daze, clinging to the comfort that at least Samuel's final days had been spent in a place of learning and prayer rather than alone in the wilderness. He told himself that this was life on the frontier, unforgiving, unpredictable, and often cruel. Over the next few months, the same story repeated again and again. 5 more children died at Prairie View Academy, each death following the same pattern: a sudden illness, a swift decline despite every effort, constant prayer, and a burial performed quickly in the small graveyard behind the chapel. In December, 10-year-old Mary Patterson from Hickory Grove died after 4 days of what Cornelius called brain fever. Her grieving parents received the news from a traveling merchant, along with a tiny prayer book Matilda said Mary had been reading as she slipped away. January claimed 14-year-old Joseph Fletcher of Sugar Creek said to have wasted away from consumption. A wooden angel Joseph had carved as a gift for his parents was sent to them with a letter announcing his death. February brought the death of 8-year-old Rebecca Martinez, whose parents had enrolled her from 40 miles away because of her sharp mind. She died of what they were told was lung fever, and a detailed letter arrived describing her funeral and quoting her supposed final prayers since weather had kept them from coming. In March, brothers David and Andrew Kelly, just 11 and 13, both succumbed within days of each other to a sudden fever. The Kensingtons told their parents that the boys' last request was to be buried side by side, so they could keep studying together in heaven. Each time, the Kensingtons appeared heartbroken. They conducted respectful services, asked for no money for the burials, and always gave families a token from their lost child, a carved cross, a favorite book, a bundle of belongings, or a lock of hair tied with a ribbon. By the summer of 1812, whispers began to grow among the parents. Every single one of these deaths had happened to boarding students, never to children, who went home each evening. Each time it happened, the other children had been sent home for planting or harvest, leaving no witnesses to the final days. And most disturbing of all, every one of the dead children had been unusually gifted Samuel, quick with numbers and letters. Mary, a natural musician. Joseph, an artist with great promise. Rebecca, a reader far beyond her years. And the Kelly brothers, bright and eager in every subject. Parents who wanted to dismiss these connections found it harder to do so when Martha Prescott began sharing the letters she had been receiving from her 10-year-old daughter, Anne. Anne had been boarding since September, and at first her letters were homesick but hopeful. Over time, though, they turned strange. She wrote about children who arrived, but never seemed to stay, about hearing sobbing at night that the Kensingtons insisted was just the wind, about lessons taught in the basement on subjects she was told never to mention at home. Most frightening of all, she described how the other students seemed to change. Once lively and curious, they became pale, withdrawn, and obedient, breaking into tears when they thought no one was watching. Martha tried to dismiss it as homesickness, but the letters kept coming darker and more specific with each passing week. She read about secret ceremonies in the basement chapel, about special students chosen for advanced instruction who never came back, and about the twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, who always seemed to be watching, always listening. By early December, Martha could no longer ignore her fears. She rode to Prairie View to bring Anne home for Christmas. But the moment she arrived, something felt terribly wrong. The building was unnaturally quiet, though she knew over 20 boarding students were still there. Gone was the sound of children laughing or reciting lessons. Instead, there was a suffocating silence that clung to every wall. Matilda Kensington answered the door with that same mournful look she had shown to so many other parents. Her hands twisted together in front of her, her pale blue eyes refusing to meet Martha's gaze. "I'm afraid Anne has taken ill," she said, voice low and heavy, wringing her hands as if in agony. "It is the same fever that claimed young Samuel and the others." It came on sudden just last night while she was at her prayers. Matilda said, her tone calm and rehearsed. "She's resting now, too weak for visitors and drifting in and out of fevered dreams. It's best you return in a few days when she's stronger and herself again. You wouldn't want to remember her this way." But Martha Prescott was a mother who had spent weeks drowning in worry, and everything about this explanation felt wrong. The words sounded polished, almost memorized, and lacked the genuine grief she had seen in other parents' accounts. The timing, the pattern, the eerie familiarity of the story, none of it felt like truth. Without hesitation, Martha pushed past Matilda into the hall and shouted her daughter's name. What answered her would haunt her for the rest of her life. A weak, terrified voice calling from somewhere deep inside the school. "Mama, help me, Mama." The cry was cut off by a door slamming and the quick pounding of footsteps on wooden floors. It was Anne's voice, unmistakable and filled with a terror no sickness could create. Martha ran toward the sound, calling back over the Kensington's frantic protests. Cornelius's deep practiced voice echoed after her, saying she misunderstood, that fever caused confusion, that she must let them handle this. But Martha's instincts had already taken over. The confrontation that followed shattered the Kensingtons' carefully cultivated calm. Cornelius appeared from the back of the building in uncharacteristic disarray. His pale gray hair wild, his hands shaking with something that looked like panic rather than piety. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, stepping in front of her, his tone strained but still trying to sound pastoral. "Anne is very ill. She might not even know who you are. In this state, children imagine things, speak of threats that don't exist. Please, for her sake, let her rest." Martha was beyond persuasion. She pushed forward, her eyes fixed on the stairs where Anne's voice had come from. Behind her, Matilda pleaded and protested. Ahead of her, blocking the bottom steps, stood Jeremiah and Josiah, pale and silent as statues. Their identical faces expressionless, but their eyes sharp and alert. For long minutes the standoff held, until the silence was broken again by Anne's voice, louder this time, and desperate. "Mama, don't let them take me to the basement again. Please don't leave me here." That single word, basement, was all Martha needed to hear. Her daughter's letters had warned of secret basement lessons, of students disappearing after special instruction. But this was no longer a vague fear. It was a plea. When Martha threatened to return with the territorial sheriff and demand a full investigation, the Kensingtons finally relented. Reluctant and still insisting on the dangers of upsetting a sick child, they led her to a small upstairs room. There lay Anne, frail and ghost-pale, but very much awake. She had lost weight since her mother had last seen her, and her hands clutched the quilt so tightly her knuckles were white. The terror in her wide eyes said more than words ever could. Matilda murmured something about the fever breaking, about confusion lingering even after recovery, about Dr. Coleman from Kaskaskia recommending rest and silence. But Martha saw the truth instantly. Her daughter was not sick, she was terrified. Anne's eyes were clear, her grip strong, her whispered words steady as she begged to go home. When Martha told the family she was leaving with Anne, at that moment the girl whispered something that froze her blood. "Mama, they're not all buried in the cemetery. Some of them are still in the basement." The ride home was silent but heavy, Anne shivering in her mother's arms, looking behind them every few minutes as if expecting to see the academy looming on the horizon. Only when the cabin door was locked and the fire burned warm around her did Anne begin to speak in a hushed, halting voice. She told of strange lessons in the basement chapel where Cornelius spoke of sacrifice and the chosen role of certain children in God's plan. The chosen ones were taken at night, while the rest of the school slept for private instruction that never ended. Those chosen never came back. And now, for the first time, Martha understood what her daughter's letters had been trying to tell her. Something unspeakable was happening beneath the floors of Prairie View Academy. Anne's story spilled out in whispers over the following nights, piece by piece, as if she were afraid the very walls of their cabin might be listening. She described a hidden stone chamber beneath the basement chapel, a cold, echoing place where Cornelius conducted what he called covenant rituals. These ceremonies, he claimed, were to prepare chosen children for special service to God. They began with a bitter drink that left the students dizzy and heavy-limbed, unable to think clearly. And then came long prayers and strange teachings she could barely remember. What she could remember, however, was this: the children selected for these rituals often never came back. At first, Cornelius told the others that those chosen had been sent on secret missions called to spread God's word in faraway lands. But as time passed, Anne realized that none of them ever sent letters. No one ever heard from them again. The twins Jeremiah and Josiah were always present in these ceremonies. Silent and ghost-like, they moved through the chamber like shadows, carrying bowls and watching the students with their unblinking pale eyes. They never spoke unless it was to whisper to their father, but their presence alone kept the children in a constant state of fear. And Anne told her mother she had lived every day in dread, never knowing if she would be the next to be summoned for a special lesson in the dead of night. Martha Prescott was not alone in her growing distrust. Thomas Fletcher, whose 13-year-old son Benjamin had allegedly died of consumption in October, had spent weeks trying to make sense of things that simply did not add up. The boy's final letter home had shaken him to the core. Benjamin, who had struggled to write simple sentences just months before, suddenly wrote in a voice that seemed entirely foreign pages, filled with grand ideas about theology, sacrifice, and divine purpose. He spoke of being chosen for advanced studies that would prepare him for a life of extraordinary service, of learning secrets that would change him forever. The letter was intelligent, composed, and frighteningly mature. Days later came the news of his death. When Thomas visited the grave that Cornelius claimed was his son's, the details disturbed him further. The earth was soft and loose, as though it had only recently been dug, and the wooden cross was so new it barely bore the marks of weather, despite weeks of exposure. That visit left him with an uneasy feeling, but it was what he learned next that truly set alarm bells ringing. Speaking with Dr. Ezra Coleman, the respected circuit physician for the area, Thomas learned that the doctor had never been summoned to treat Benjamin or any student from Prairie View during their final illnesses. In fact, Dr. Coleman had never once been called to the academy. The Kensingtons always claimed to tend to the sick themselves, citing Cornelius's supposed training in herbal remedies, scripture, and faith healing. In isolation, that might have seemed reasonable. On the frontier, faith-based treatment was not unusual. But when combined with the school's shocking mortality rate and the refusal of outside help, the pattern was deeply sinister. Adding to this unease were the accounts of Jacob Winters, a seasoned fur trapper whose route often took him past the academy. Winters, a solitary man with a sharp eye for details, began to notice things others did not. He saw heavy smoke rising from the chimneys on warm nights when no heating was needed. He noticed light in windows when the building should have been empty during planting and harvest seasons. He saw figures moving about after midnight shadows against lantern glow in a place that was supposed to be sleeping. These strange observations, coupled with the whispered stories of parents like Martha and Thomas, began to weave a picture of a place that was nothing like the haven of faith and learning it pretended to be. Something was very wrong at Prairie View Academy. Jacob Winters's quiet observations of life around Prairie View Academy began to form a pattern that no one else had been able to see. On several pre-dawn mornings, he had seen candlelight flickering in the upper windows when the building should have been dark. Even more disturbing, he had heard the unmistakable sound of digging behind the chapel under the cover of night. On 3 separate occasions, he spotted fresh graves in the Academy cemetery graves that were far too small to hold a human body. When he casually mentioned these strange details to Cornelius Kensington during a chance meeting at the general store, the reaction was swift and defensive. Cornelius's face hardened with anger before he offered an unconvincing explanation about moving the remains of beloved pets that had died during the winter. Over time, Winters also noticed a chilling change in the behavior of the children who attended the academy. The lively, talkative boys and girls he had first encountered on the trails became pale, timid, and unnaturally obedient as the months passed. It was as if the life had been drained out of them. Most unsettling were the midnight sightings of the twins Jeremiah and Josiah, when they believed themselves unseen. Winters had watched them burying bundles behind the chapel, loading heavy sacks into wagons in the early hours of the morning, and keeping watch over the darkened prairie as if guarding something they didn't want anyone to find. Privately, other parents began to share their own observations. The pieces of a disturbing puzzle started to fit together. The strange letters home the sudden changes in their children's behavior and the high number of unexplained deaths. For months, no one wanted to say aloud what they were thinking. The Kensingtons had built a reputation as devoted educators and protectors of frontier values. They had given so many families hope that to accuse them of wrongdoing without proof felt like an act of betrayal. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The final push came when Martha Prescott began sharing Anne's story with other families. Her account of strange basement rituals, children disappearing after special ceremonies, and the twins' constant surveillance turned vague suspicion into real fear. Thomas Fletcher added his concerns about the strange grave of his son Benjamin, and Jacob Winters contributed his observations of the night. It was clear to everyone that something evil was happening behind the closed doors of Prairie View Academy. Winter 1812 into 1813 should have been a time of safety for the Kensingtons. Heavy snow cut off the academy from the outside world, making travel almost impossible. Only a few boarding students remained, and with so few witnesses, the family no longer felt the need to maintain their perfect image. This complacency allowed the truth to start leaking out, safe in her home at last. Anne's nightmares became a window into what she had endured. Through broken and halting descriptions, she spoke of covenant ceremonies held deep beneath the chapel. There, in a stone-walled chamber, Cornelius presided over strange rituals that he claimed would prepare chosen children for a life of service to God. Each ceremony began with a bitter drink that left them weak, confused, and unable to resist. She described the sensation of being outside her own body, watching but unable to act. At the center of the room stood a cold stone altar that Cornelius insisted had been blessed by angels. Standing beside it like statues, Jeremiah and Josiah recited responses in a strange language that might have been Latin or might have been nonsense, designed to sound holy. Matilda played the organ, filling the chamber with a slow, mournful sound that made the whole thing feel like a funeral. Those chosen for these ceremonies never came back. The Kensingtons claimed they had been sent on sacred missions or elevated to a higher calling. But Anne remembered the smell of candle smoke and bitter herbs, the feel of the stone beneath her hands, and the cold certainty that once the ritual ended, something terrible happened to those children. Her nightmares also revealed something else. The building was riddled with tunnels and hidden rooms connected to the chapel basement by concealed doors. These passages led to punishment rooms, where children who disobeyed were taken away. The walls there echoed with crying and pleading sounds she would never forget. She described the hidden architecture in such detail, the placement of the beams, the shape of the stonework, even the pattern of the drainage channels, that her mother knew she had seen these places with her own eyes. Meanwhile, Thomas Fletcher could no longer ignore the evidence of fakery in the Academy cemetery. Using an iron rod to probe the earth beneath his son's grave, he found no sign of a coffin. The soil was loose and shallow, filled with stones and debris, and the cross marking the spot was freshly cut, untouched by months of wind and rain. Many of the other graves showed the same signs. None of them bore the weathering of time that Cornelius claimed, and all appeared to be recent. The final piece came when Dr. Ezra Coleman, traveling on his winter rounds to treat a family for influenza 30 miles from Prairie View, met a woman named Sarah Henderson. She had been hired as a servant at the academy the previous summer and had lasted only 3 weeks before fleeing in fear. Her account confirmed the whispered rumors. Sarah described a place where fear hung over every child like a shadow. She had been startled by how silent and watchful the students were, how they jumped at sudden noises. The twins constantly stalked the halls, appearing silently in doorways to observe both students and staff. Most terrifying of all were the sounds that drifted up from the basement at night, chanting muffled crying and the dragging of heavy objects. When Sarah had asked Matilda about these noises, the reply was always the same. These were prayer meetings for students in need of spiritual guidance. But Sarah knew what prayer sounded like, and what she heard was something far darker. Sarah Henderson's testimony gave a voice to everything the parents feared, and it would be the spark that set the final chain of events into motion. Sarah Henderson's testimony provided the final and most devastating pieces of the puzzle. She described how during her short time working at Prairie View Academy, she discovered dried blood on the stone floors of the basement and strange sharp implements that looked more like surgical tools than anything used for treating animals. When she asked Cornelius about them, he dismissed her concerns with a casual explanation that the tools were for injured livestock. But Henderson, who had spent her entire life on farms, knew the difference. These were not tools for animal care. Her employment came to an abrupt end after a moment of terrible discovery. While scrubbing the basement chapel, she noticed a narrow gap along the base of one of the stone walls. Pulling at it, she revealed a concealed doorway. Beyond it lay a small hidden chamber, and inside she saw restraints bolted to the floor, and objects whose purpose she could only guess at implements of pain, not prayer. Almost immediately, the Kensingtons appeared furious. They accused her of slander, threw her off the property that very hour, and warned her never to speak of what she had seen, or God's wrath would find her. Henderson's story, added to the growing accounts of parents and witnesses, finally tipped the balance. Yet even with all these testimonies, taking action was risky. The Kensingtons were still respected figures, and without physical proof, territorial officials had been unwilling to intervene. That changed in early February 1813 when a traveling merchant named Marcus Webb, caught in a vicious snowstorm, took shelter in an abandoned cabin 2 miles from the academy. From there, he spent an entire night watching the hilltop. Through the blowing snow, he saw lanterns moving back and forth between the academy and the woods behind it. Figures carried heavy bundles and returned with empty arms. Several times he heard the sound of picks and shovels biting into frozen ground. Webb's sharp merchant's mind noted every detail: the location of the digging, the timing, the number of trips. By the time he reached Kaskaskia, he was able to give a precise account of what he had seen. And because Webb was a neutral, respected outsider, his testimony carried more weight than all the whispers and rumors combined. With the combined weight of Webb's account, Anne Prescott's testimony, Sarah Henderson's revelations, Thomas Fletcher's graveyard investigation, and Jacob Winters's observations, the authorities could no longer remain silent. Captain James Mitchell, the territorial sheriff, a hard-bitten veteran of frontier law, accepted the task of investigating. He was accustomed to violence and hardship, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the allegations leveled against Prairie View Academy. Mitchell assembled a small, trusted team. Deputy William Crawford, a disciplined former Army officer, experienced with organized crime. Dr. Ezra Coleman, whose medical expertise would be crucial for identifying foul play. And Reverend Samuel Hayes, the Methodist circuit rider, to advise on religious matters and to challenge the Kensington's theological justifications. On April 15, 1813, under the guise of a routine inspection of schools for compliance and possible funding, the group rode up the muddy hill to the academy. At first glance, the building seemed deserted. There were no children's faces peering from the windows, no voices reciting lessons or singing hymns, only a heavy, unnatural silence. Cornelius met them at the gate. To a casual observer, he might have seemed as calm as ever, but Mitchell's trained eye noticed the cracks. Immediately trembling hands, darting eyes that kept flicking toward the cemetery, and beads of sweat forming on his brow, despite the cool air. His voice was warm, but beneath it, there was tension. Captain Mitchell. What an unexpected pleasure. How may Prairie View Academy serve the territorial government today? I trust this visit means recognition of our work and perhaps some consideration for the funding we've requested. Mitchell kept his expression neutral, explaining that the government was investigating reports of unusually high child mortality at frontier schools and was here to ensure proper medical care and record keeping. He asked to review all records relating to illnesses and burials. Cornelius's face changed at once. His voice faltered. He claimed that all records had been destroyed in a fire caused by a knocked-over candle the previous winter. Conveniently, every document that could explain the deaths had been lost. Dr. Coleman immediately recognized the excuse for what it was. Frontier institutions took extraordinary care to preserve such records. The timing of the so-called accident just before the investigation was too perfect to believe. Next came the cemetery. It told a story that the Kensingtons could not. Several graves showed signs of recent disturbance. Soil that should have been settled was loose and uneven, as though it had been dug into within days. Using a long metal rod, Dr. Coleman probed 2 graves and found nothing. No coffins, no bodies. The rod met only stones and empty soil. When Mitchell confronted the family, Matilda began wringing her hands, babbling about wild animals, digging up graves, and the family moving the remains to safer spots. But there were no signs of scavenging, and the explanation was nonsense. Throughout the confrontation, the twins Jeremiah and Josiah remained silent, standing at their parents' shoulders like pale ghosts. They never spoke, their faces blank, communicating only with the occasional flick of a glance. Their eerie presence unnerved even the seasoned sheriff. Inside the building, Reverend Hayes questioned Cornelius about his teachings. His answers, though articulate, revealed a dangerous obsession with suffering obedience and sacrifice, especially as they related to children. His descriptions of refining the spirit through pain and using youth as vessels for divine purpose struck the minister as twisted, a perversion of Scripture. At that moment, Mitchell made his decision. The time for courtesy had passed. He invoked his authority as territorial sheriff and announced that they would be searching the building immediately. It was a decision that would lead to the discovery of the truth. A truth far more terrible than anyone in Prairie View had dared to imagine. As Mitchell and his team moved room to room, the Kensington family's carefully maintained composure began to unravel. Their protests grew more frantic with every step, no longer the dignified appeals of respectable educators, but desperate attempts to keep the investigators away from specific areas of the building. It quickly became clear that this wasn't about privacy or reputation. They were hiding something. The upper floors of the academy only deepened the sense of dread. For a school that claimed to house dozens of students, there was almost no sign of life. Classrooms were tidy to the point of lifelessness, their books and supplies unused for weeks, maybe months. Dormitories looked more like a stage set than living quarters. Neat beds, no clutter, no personal belongings, no trace of children who had lived there. It was when the investigators forced their way into the basement that the true cracks in the Kensington's facade began to show. Cornelius insisted these areas were unsafe, that the foundation was unstable. But Mitchell would not be swayed. As they descended into the dim, musty corridors, the family's behavior shifted from pleading to panic. Deputy Crawford's trained eye caught something odd about one of the stone wall's hairline seams, as though what looked like solid masonry was hiding something. Closer inspection revealed concealed openings, cleverly camouflaged, leading into a warren of hidden chambers carved into the earth. Matilda's composure finally shattered. She threw herself against the deputies, sobbing and begging them not to go any farther, insisting the rooms held sacred relics too holy for outsiders to see. Cornelius dropped all pretense of calm ranting about divine missions and the necessity of sacrifice. And the twins, silent, watchful, their pale faces, stoltly unreadable, stood frozen, as if waiting for the terrible secrets to be revealed. Mitchell had seen violence before, but never this. He knew now that he was facing not a single crime, but an organized system of abuse and murder. And as they prepared to enter those hidden chambers, he understood that whatever they found would haunt the entire community forever. The evidence was overwhelming. On April 16, 1813, the sheriff placed the entire Kensington family under arrest on charges of fraud and conspiracy, knowing that these were only the beginning. Then came the testimony that finally revealed the full scope of what had been happening behind those walls. 11-year-old Rebecca Hawthorne, who had returned home from the academy just 3 weeks earlier, found the courage to tell her parents and Sheriff Mitchell what she had witnessed. Her account confirmed every whispered fear. Rebecca described an environment of constant surveillance and fear. The twins appeared everywhere, silently observing, while children learned to hide any spark of independence. Students who asked questions or hesitated in their obedience were singled out for special instruction, a punishment disguised as honor. Obedience was rewarded with small privileges, while resistance was crushed with psychological and physical torment. Most damning of all was her account of the so-called covenant ceremonies. These rituals were presented as a privilege reserved for the most spiritually gifted. In reality, Rebecca explained they were a death sentence. She told of one February night when a boy named Peter Caldwell, brilliant, eager, and barely 13, was chosen. At first, it seemed like an honor. The ceremony began with prayers, hymns, and scripture. Then came the herbal concoction that left Peter weak and compliant. From the main chapel, he was taken into a concealed chamber, a room with a stone altar surrounded by strange carvings and dozens of flickering candles. There Cornelius chanted over him, the twins assisting at his side while Matilda played solemn music on a small harmonium. What followed was torture masked as holy suffering. For hours, Rebecca heard his cries. Cornelius spoke of purification, of breaking the body to free the soul, while Jeremiah and Josiah held him down. Peter's calls for his parents, his pleas for mercy, were dismissed as tests of faith. When he finally fell silent, Cornelius declared that he had transcended, that his spirit was now ready for a divine mission. But Peter did not die that night. Rebecca whispered, trembling, that she heard him in the following days, weak and fading, locked in that hidden room. And then on her final night at the school, she awoke to sounds in the basement and crept from her bed. Through a crack in the floorboards, she saw the twins dragging Peter's body out of the chamber. She described it in broken fragments, lantern light, whispered voices, heavy burlap sacks, the eerie calm on Jeremiah and Josiah's faces as they prepared to dispose of him. Rebecca's testimony, combined with the physical evidence in the cemetery and the hidden rooms, gave Mitchell the map he needed. The horrors that had been whispered about for years were no longer rumors. They were fact. And with this revelation, the final terrible truth of Prairie View Academy was about to come into the light. The return to Prairie View Academy, with a larger team of deputies and territorial officials, stripped away the last of the Kensington family's deception. This time the search was methodical. Every floor, every wall, and every inch of ground behind the chapel was examined, and the secrets that had been hidden for 3 years finally came to light. The investigators found the chamber Rebecca Hawthorne had described exactly where she said it would be, deep beneath the academy, a stone room carved out of the earth. Inside, a cold altar stood at its center, surrounded by carved symbols and ritual tools. Heavy iron shackles were bolted to the walls at heights meant for restraining children, and the floor was dark with deep stains that Dr. Ezra Coleman identified at once as human blood. The arrangement of the room left no doubt this had been a place of ritualized torture disguised as piety. From there, the search moved to the cellar and into the frozen ground of the woods behind the building. Guided by Rebecca's testimony and Marcus Webb's reports of lantern-lit digging, they found shallow graves. As the earth was turned, the horror became undeniable. At least 15 bodies were unearthed, each bearing marks of prolonged suffering. Some showed mutilation, others dismemberment, and all had been buried with strange patterns of stones and carved symbols. These were not natural deaths. This was deliberate, organized murder. Dr. Coleman's medical examination confirmed the worst suspicions: these children had been tortured before they died. The injuries matched the tools and devices found in the hidden chambers. In Cornelius Kensington's private study, the final evidence was discovered: journals meticulously kept over 3 years, written in his careful hand. These pages revealed the inner workings of a man who had abandoned all normal human conscience. Cornelius wrote about the spiritual energy of children and his belief that pain and sacrifice could create a bridge between heaven and earth. His entries described each ritual in detail, cataloging the suffering of each child as if they were scientific experiments. He noted which victims endured pain silently, which broke down, and which, in his twisted theology, released the most divine energy through their deaths. He viewed frontier children as especially pure, believing their agony could be transformed into power. The journals also exposed a financial motive. The Kensingtons collected tuition from families, even continuing to take money for children who were already dead, writing letters claiming the children were recovering from illness, while in reality, their remains lay buried in the woods. With this scheme, they built their wealth, purchased land, and sustained their carefully crafted facade as devoted teachers. The twins' involvement, long suspected, was confirmed beyond question. The journals documented their roles not only as assistants, but as eager participants. When investigators searched their quarters, they found small, macabre collections of trinkets taken from murdered children. Buttons, scraps of fabric, locks of hair. Crude drawings filled with violent imagery made clear that Jeremiah and Josiah had grown to relish the cruelty. The trial began in September 1813, held mostly behind closed doors. Even in a hardened frontier, the nature of these crimes was almost impossible to comprehend. Judge William Harrison presided with Attorney General Samuel Edwards leading the prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming. Parents, surviving students, and community members testified, each account adding another layer to the nightmare. Cornelius Kensington never expressed remorse. On the stand, he delivered long, measured speeches about visions from God, about the necessity of sacrifice, and about how the children he had killed were chosen for a higher form of existence. His words, spoken with calm conviction, chilled everyone in the courtroom. Dr. Coleman testified that despite his delusions, Cornelius understood exactly what he had done and had gone to great lengths to conceal it, proof of both guilt and sanity. Matilda's defense centered on her claim that she had been manipulated by her husband, controlled so completely that she believed murder was divine service. But letters and survivor testimony painted another picture, a woman who had taken an active role in selecting victims, writing lies to grieving families, and taking satisfaction in their suffering. The twins never spoke. They sat in court like statues, responding only in writing when absolutely necessary. Their silent, vacant stares unnerved even the most experienced observers, and psychologists who examined them concluded that they had been shaped so completely by their father's beliefs that they no longer possessed any sense of empathy or moral judgment. The trial's most powerful moment came when Anne Prescott, barely 12 years old, stood before the court. Her voice was steady as she described the ceremonies, the hidden rooms, and the endless nights of fear. Her testimony corroborated Rebecca Hawthorne's account point by point, and she added names, faces, and details that matched the physical evidence exactly. By the time she finished, there was no longer any doubt. The facade of the Prairie View Academy had been ripped away, and the world now saw it for what it truly was, a house of horrors. The verdict was inevitable, but the scars left on the frontier community would last for generations. All 4 members of the Kensington family were convicted on multiple counts of murder and conspiracy, and the evidence against them was so overwhelming that the jury took less than 2 hours to deliver unanimous guilty verdicts on every charge. Judge Harrison handed down the harshest sentence possible under territorial law, death by hanging, to be carried out in Kaskaskia on November 30th, 1813. The executions themselves became a spectacle. Hundreds of settlers came to witness justice for the crimes that had shaken the foundations of their communities. Cornelius Kensington used his final moments to deliver a sermon, claiming his death would bring divine retribution and that the children he had killed would return to punish those who interfered with God's work. Matilda's last words were an apology to the families of their victims, though many doubted her sincerity. The twins remained silent to the end, dying without ever explaining their actions. The aftermath of the Kensington case scarred the Illinois frontier for generations. Parents became deeply suspicious of schools, especially boarding academies, and preferred to keep their children close to home, even if it meant a poor education. Trust in strangers vanished. The very day after the executions, angry families burned Prairie View Academy to the ground, erasing the physical reminder of what had happened. Ministers consecrated the ground, moved the victims' remains to a new cemetery, and held memorial services to try to give the grieving parents some peace. Territorial authorities, fearing panic and a mass exodus of settlers, sealed most of the records. They encouraged survivors and witnesses to move far away, and heavily censored newspaper reports, omitting details about the rituals and the horrors uncovered in the Academy's hidden chambers. This suppression means the full scope of the crimes may never be known. Many historians believe that the 15 confirmed deaths were only a fraction of the true total, and that similar crimes may have been committed by the Kensingtons during their years in Pennsylvania. The case devastated the families of the victims. Some left the Illinois Territory forever, unable to live near the place where their children had suffered so horribly. Others stayed building gardens and churches in their children's memory. But for all of them, every sound of a child's laughter was a reminder of what had been taken. The Kensington case became a grim lesson in the vulnerability of isolated frontier communities. The family had been able to operate for years because the parents trusted their appearance of piety and knowledge, never imagining that such evil could wear a mask of goodness. It also showed how close the horror came to continuing indefinitely. If not for Martha Prescott's refusal to be turned away, for Anne's whispered pleas for Rebecca Hawthorne's courage, and for the determination of the parents, who refused to accept the Kensingtons' explanations, the murders could have gone on for decades. In the years that followed, frontier life was transformed. Suspicion replaced the trust that once bound these small communities together. Schools struggled to regain credibility, and literacy rates stagnated for years. The Prairie View horror remains a stark warning that evil can hide behind respectability and righteousness, that credentials and religion can be twisted into weapons, and that predators will always exploit blind trust. What do you think? Was everything revealed in the trial? Or do you believe there were other victims whose stories never came to light? Do you agree with the decision to suppress so much of what happened, or should the truth have been told? No matter how terrible, and how might the history of education on the frontier have changed if these crimes had been publicized as a warning to others? If this story gripped you, subscribe, share, and stay with us, because in our next video we'll uncover another forgotten crime. The tale of a traveling preacher whose charm hid a trail of vanished families across 3 states, and the federal marshal who spent 10 years tracking him. Prairie View Academy is gone now, burned to ashes. Its graves moved and its name deliberately erased, but the questions it raises about trust, power, and the protection of children remain just as urgent today. Background checks and oversight may make us feel safe, but the truth remains, the most dangerous monsters often look like the people we are taught to trust.